This is the Straight Up Breakdown Podcast.
Exclusively on the Herd Out Media Network.
Tell it to me straight up.
Hello, and welcome into the Straight Up Breakdown Podcast, proudly part of the Hail Varsity Network. I am Greg Smith, I was going to say new month, new me, but I feel like the statute of limitations might be up on that because I looked up and we're already 4 days into the month. I do not know where time is going, but the point of this podcast is not to talk to you about the time, it is to talk sports. So today I am joined by Katie Heindl, who's a basketball writer extraordinaire. You can find her all over the place at Dime, at the Dishes and Dimes podcast. And you can read her writing at basketballfeelings.com. Katie, thank you very much for being on the show. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me on. But I was going to say, if you could figure out, like, if you had any answers to why time is melting, I was all ears, but
oh, well, I'm sure there'd be a lot of people, maybe, I don't know, like I feel like I look up and then the time is just gone. Like it was just yesterday, it feels like, when we were starting football season, and now basketball season is here. Totally fine with basketball season being here, but I just feel like I look up, a blink of an eye has gone by and we're into the next thing.
It's accelerating. Yeah, I think it's like it accelerated over the past year and a half in the pandemic, and now it just hasn't gotten back to normal, and maybe it never will. You're
right. We'll just be like in this sped up time loop from here on out, which, I mean, it is what it is. We'll just have to adjust. Now, before we get too deep into this, one of the reasons that we're recording at the time we are right now, is, for those of you listening, you don't care, but it's Monday morning at 8:30 Central Time. It's because Katie has a Raptors game tonight that she is covering. And so I have to ask you about that before we get into kind of the main chunk of what we're talking about. It's a new era in Toronto. No more Kyle Lowry after a lot of changes. So, previously to that, with DeMar DeRozan not being out, like, what's the vibe right now around the Raptors and this kind of new era that they're going into?
The vibe's really good. I'd say the vibes are honestly at an all-time high, which is nice because I think it was quite bittersweet for a little while this summer. After Lowry, after it was clear that he was leaving, and I think even around media day, seeing him in a Heat jersey for the first time threw a lot of fans. It definitely threw me. But I think the energy behind the new team, Scotty Barnes, Delano Banton, and then some of the guys that are coming back that were added at the end of last season, Yuta Watanabe, Gillespie, these are guys who are just so ecstatic. One, to be on the Raptors, and then now you have this other element, and this is what's happening too for Fred VanVleet and Pascal Siakam, got here before, but half this team, I'd say probably actually more than half this team now, has never played in Toronto, which is kind of a wild thing to wrap your head around, just being that they were in the bubble and then they kind of went to their other bubble in Tampa for the season. So the energy is extremely high. Fans are really excited. I saw we have our outdoor viewing arena beside the Scotiabank Arena called Jurassic Park, right. But usually that only gets activated during the playoffs. And I saw Reddit posts of people being like, is anyone going down tonight? For the first preseason game. Okay. It's raining here, but I think people are going to be out. Everybody is very excited.
Yeah, that's an exciting thing. And it's so wild. We started off kind of talking about just time flying by, and it feels like, and I had totally forgotten that the Raptors basically would have that many guys that have not played actually in Toronto. Because it gets kind of lost that they played that season in Tampa after being in the bubble. And then just coming back to Toronto, the fans do have to be really excited. So it's crazy that they're so excited that they want to activate Jurassic Park for the first preseason game. Do we know, are they going to try and do it?
I mean, that's the thing. People can go, but I don't think the team or any broadcaster is setting up outside today.
Okay. Which they might go just to.
Yeah, people might go just to be together. But yeah, the team, I don't think is going to encourage anything like that yet.
Okay. All right. That makes sense. Maybe save it for the first regular season game.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe that's the way to go on that one. Okay. Now, each week we have a couple of segments that are mainstays of the show. The first one is called Coach Speak, where we go over something that a coach, player, or a talking head said, and then we give you the straight up breakdown of what they meant.
Coach Speak to Real Talk.
This week it comes courtesy of 76ers star Joel Embiid, who always has something to say. But when he goes long form and like really dives into stuff, I find him as interesting as really anyone in sports. And of course, he had something to say about the Ben Simmons situation, in which Ben Simmons has basically demanded a trade and has said that he is not reporting. And I will link to in the show notes like the full thing that he said, because it's definitely worth checking out. But I want to read this part and get your reaction, Katie. He said in part, "So I feel like our teams have always been built around his needs. It was kind of surprising to see. We'll say that even going back to, I mean, the reason that we signed Al, we got rid of Jimmy, which I thought was a mistake, just to make sure that Ben, needed the ball in his hands. And that's a decision that they made. Like I said, it's surprising." Katie, what does that actually mean?
The tricky thing about it is he's not entirely wrong, because I think for a long time, the Sixers are they're just trying to push Ben Simmons into whatever role they wanted him to be in that season. And I think that's the tricky part. And that's where Ben Simmons ran into so many problems with the Sixers, is because he never could just play one role. They really wanted him to be this, whether it's like a flex or a stretch, like he never got to actually settle into one thing. I know Philly fans take a lot of umbrage with that, and I think he just didn't necessarily work as hard as they would have wanted. Obviously, right. Embiid is more of a Philly style workhorse player, I think. But I disparage a little when he said we got rid of Jimmy Butler, because like Jimmy Butler left. Jimmy Butler like saw what was going on and was like, I'm out of here. There's like a team that really is going to utilize me a lot better, that I'm going to just gel with like right off the jump. And I think what I think Embiid is lacking a little bit there is the perspective that the Sixers are trying to do this with him too. But the Sixers' problem is like, they're not a very multitasking front office. Right. They're not really able to manage two players like that at once. And I don't even manage in the sense of like personality management or anything like that. I just mean even like what the expectations were on the floor. They never really set those out very clear for the two of them. They started playing Embiid in the post more last season, and that worked really well. But they never really gave that kind of, when Embiid is just like Ben, they wanted the ball in Ben's hands at all times. It's like, that's not actually what I saw in the playoffs. I feel like they were trying to keep the ball out of his hands at all times.
Yeah, which is a whole another can of worms, and kind of in part how we got here, right? So I think that they have such a unique situation, I think, in how we ended up where we are with the Sixers, because I think you're right. I think that they do this. The organization has struggled to figure out how to build around both of them, how the play style was going to work. Then you kind of had, remember in the beginning of those two coming together, like Embiid was still getting hurt a lot. So you still had to kind of guard against whether or not he was even going to be out there for most of the time, while also trying to figure out, hey, what do we do with Simmons, who is clearly, and I've talked to a few people about this too, like Simmons is a weird case because he is clearly very good, but he clearly has very large limitations. And so you end up in kind of a tricky spot with him, because he kind of has to be a max type player by virtue of the things that he does really well. But at the same time, as Doc Rivers kind of said, I don't know if he can kind of be the guy that's going to lead you to a championship as your point guard, right? Mm-hmm. Like, unless you totally revamp everything around him, which they already have a large piece, like figuratively and literally, in Joel Embiid, right? So I do think that they have just struggled to figure out how they're going to build around those two and how they want them to play. But it's layered as to how we actually got here. And that's just talking about the on-court fit. That is beyond, like, if we get into kind of the personality, obviously, of Joel Embiid, and then what's kind of become the personality of Ben Simmons, and kind of how he's reacted to all of this, which has kind of culminated in this trade request.
I honestly don't blame him, like Simmons, for what, I mean, when someone tells you in like no uncertain terms, like his team told him at the end of last season, his coach, like supposedly like his co-star player, we don't really want him here, and we don't necessarily trust him, and we don't know that like what we want, a championship, we're going to get with him. I mean, I think he just took that at face value and was like, all right, so I won't come back. I mean, granted, there's still a lot of money on the line, and like a few years on the line for him. But the fact that it's funny because now, like, Ben Simmons was never like a very vocal or loud player, but now like more through his absence and his silences. But I wanted to go back to what you were saying before, just in terms of like how these two did or did not end up complementing each other on the floor. And I think we did talk a little bit about the front office, not necessarily putting either of them in a position to thrive. But I think the player that Ben was never going to be complemented by the player that Embiid is on the floor. And that was going to work to the Sixers' detriment. You know, there's plenty of teams where Ben could go and like, I don't think he should be the guy, but I also don't think Embiid is that guy. Either. Sixers are still short that guy with two guys, just using the guy a lot, but two guys that are being put up as like, no, this is the lead of our franchise, this is our star, and this is like who we want all of our players to look to on the floor. But I don't necessarily think either of them is comfortable with that weight.
Yeah, and it's interesting because going back to Joel's comment about Jimmy Butler, is that to me was actually the right situation.
Yes.
And the perfect guy really to then lead them. Now, I don't know if long-term, and obviously it did not, but I don't know if long-term it would have been tenable to have Joel, Ben, and Jimmy, and have Jimmy leading both of those guys. I think you always were going to have to pick one or the other. Personally, I would have picked Embiid and then let it be Jimmy and Embiid, because I just think that they play off of each other better than Simmons. And just full disclosure, I am not a huge Simmons guy. Like, it's just not like to me, when you have a player that commands that much money, and therefore he's going to have to always have a status on your team, but you can't really rely on him in the playoffs, like in any shape or form. Like, I just can't, I have a really hard time with that. Like, I can't even get the words out. Like, I have a hard time with trying to build my team around Ben Simmons. And so I'm always going to be a little bit clouded by that, what I think they should have done with the Jimmy Butler situation. But then that's also to say, like, it's easy to say now that, hey, yeah, they should have kept Jimmy Butler, but there were two things that I think that don't ever get brought up in that situation. One, the money. Like, there was a lot of money the Philly was going to have to pay out to keep everyone there. And then also Jimmy's personality as well. Talking about personalities, like, yeah, you're going to have some combustible situations there with him around too. And then him and Embiid, you were also bound to have some issues. So there was just a lot there. Like, in a way, Jimmy is, and as now Joel is kind of pining for Jimmy Butler to have stayed. There's a little bit of revisionist history, but I can understand why.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that at that point in his career, like after the Bulls kind of cut him loose, after I think, Jimmy Butler had gone to them and said, I want to lead this team. Like, I want you to invest in me, essentially asking them. And then the whole situation with the Wolves, I do think Jimmy was ready to lead a team, but I think the team that he landed on was like, nah, we're good. Like, we have these guys, like we have these two guys, and you're just going to have to play around them. And like, that's not good for Jimmy Butler on the floor either. Like, he's not that kind of player. So there almost wasn't enough space, I think, on that Sixers team for the three of them. Like, money aside, the money, I could tell, yeah, that was making you antsy. But
Right.
I think, like, as we said before, I think Jimmy is now in the perfect position to go back to Kyle Lowry very briefly, because I could go back to Kyle Lowry at length, but I think
people just love Kyle Lowry.
They really, from Toronto really do, but I hope everybody else does. But I think like Lowry is that perfect curb for Jimmy Butler, and Jimmy has said it, like he said it in media day too. He was like, I'm a really difficult person to tell what to do and to kind of like come at, but like, that's what I expect from Kyle. I want him in my ear all the time, and he'll do that. So I think that situation has worked out how it should, but the Sixers, it's very tough. Like, it is very tough because Embiid, as you said, when he goes long form like this, it's super fascinating because he kind of runs, you get to see him run through all of his thoughts and his feelings, and they kind of develop and swirl as he goes. He starts very brooding, and then he kind of lightens up, and then he's just free flowing and telling you anything you want to hear. But I don't know how the front office must look at that, because they got to keep this guy happy too, And as you said, he was like pretty injury prone for a couple of seasons there, and they're looking at quite a few minutes for him to play this season if Ben doesn't come back. So they need someone also to come in and support him too.
Yeah, and that's even before, like, without knowing what they'll eventually get back. You usually are not going to get equal value and those sorts of things. Like, and what is his value? Like, there's a lot there. Like, that one is going to be definitely one of the bigger storylines especially on court for this upcoming season, as they're kind of a contender to come out of the East. But one of the things that I feel like it's become the thing off the court as we kind of lead into the season and everybody was going through their media days last week was just vaccinations. Okay. So I don't even know where to begin with what happened with all of this, because it just felt like one by one, there were just different, and stars is used loosely here because it depends on which player we're talking about. But they became a little bit more famous in some cases than they probably even deserved or wanted to be, looking at Andrew Wiggins and Jonathan Isaac, for just their stance on, I shouldn't say anti-vax, because Bradley Beal came out and said that he was not anti-vax. I still want to say that is somebody got a hold of him and said, hey, look at this money that's about to come off of the table. But we'll get into that in a second. But essentially what happened with Bradley Beal, Andrew Wiggins, Kyrie Irving, Jonathan Isaac, and as you wrote on Basketball Feelings, LeBron James, by kind of his lack of own conviction, and we're going to get to LeBron because I am a Lakers guy, and so I'm going to have to get into that. But just that storyline, I guess I'll start here. Did it surprise you that became such a big storyline as teams were rolling out through their media days?
It did, honestly, it did. It did because, I mean, you knew there was still this sort of pocket of players who obviously hadn't been vaccinated yet. I think I knew that a lot of it would clarify towards the start of the season. I didn't necessarily see that all clarifying on media day. I didn't really think those questions would get asked of every player on media day. And I think the questions that got asked of those players, a lot of those players, aside from Wiggins, were pretty like telling in their responses. Like Beal talked about it at length. Kyrie said, like, he's like, oh, I didn't want to create any more hoopla with this, but it's like, well, you knew what you were doing.
Yeah, I feel like Kyrie is that guy that does that stuff and then comes back on the back end and say, oh, I didn't want to create any hoopla, but he's always creating hoopla. Exactly.
He's too smart. Like, he's too smart to not understand what the fallout's going to be.
Right.
But overall, I think it was a really disheartening, I have to say, experience from what you typically look for in media day. On one hand, I was happy to know kind of where we collectively stood. But on the other hand, like, just hearing a lot of them talk about it, especially to say, like, I would single Beal out just for the comments that he made, saying that he was sick. Well, he said, I was sick. I didn't get that sick. I just lost my sense of smell. But like, that's your brain. Like, that's your nervous system, like that something substantial has happened in your body for that to happen. And when he made those comments about, kind of like flippantly, like, well, it just keeps you out of the hospital. How good, like, what's so good about that? Like, that's actually a phenomenal breakthrough.
Right. And it's kind of like along the same lines of what the one guy that I didn't mention, Michael Porter Jr., mm-hmm. where he said a lot of those same things as someone who's had COVID twice. Speaking of Michael Porter Jr., he's had it twice. And he said a lot of the same things that Beal said. And I just feel like there's and this is not particular to like these just NBA players, because you hear this in society at large, but there is still just such a fundamental misunderstanding, I think, of what the vaccine is supposed to do for you, what the benefit is of it, and why you would want to avoid that. To hear someone say that, mm-hmm. it just keeps you out of the hospital is like flat out ridiculous. Like, I don't understand like why we're still we're well over a year. We're basically 2 years into this pandemic, and we're still at that point where we're trying to educate people on why it would be good to stay out of the hospital if you got like very ill, or why it's a like really big deal that to your body that you lost your sense of smell or taste. Like, I just don't understand why we're still at that push-pull about just basic level information and education, especially considering and knowing that a lot of these sports teams obviously have the resources to bring in any expert that they want to bring in. Beal being in Washington is another whole thing of this, because this happened with the Washington football team, where when they came to start the season, I forget the actual name of the player, apologize, but he sat up there and said, I need to find out more information. And then it turned out that their football team actually brought in people from like the CDC or from the government to actually come and talk to them. So you had the information available. So it's just a frustrating situation. And it's all to varying degrees, right, on what's about to happen moving forward. I personally think someone like Beal, we're going to look up and he got the shot. Like, I feel like that's going to happen. I think of all of these guys, like I think Kyrie Irving and Andrew Wiggins, I think they're going to ride this thing out to the end. Like, I think that they're really going to try and not do it. And then the one thing that becomes a little bit of an X factor in this, just like basketball, like strictly basketball speaking, is how do teammates respond to this, right? So if you're Andrew Wiggins and you go to Steph Curry and you go to Klay Thompson and you say, hey, I'm not going to do this, and I'm willing to sacrifice, what is it, $15 million, I think it is. I think he's paid 31 million. I'm willing to do that. I'm going to do that for these principles. And those two guys say, hey, we're trying to win this championship. The window is closing. Me, Steph Curry, I'm only going to be this good for so long. Like, those are going to present some really interesting conversations.
Yeah, I do have a point to make about Steph, but I just wanted to quickly go back to Beal in that what he was saying, like what really struck me about his logic was when he said, oh, it keeps you out of the hospital. And then he talked a little bit about, we don't talk enough about the bad side effects people get from the vaccine and how you could miss games from that. So if his logic was you might miss games if you get bad reaction from the vaccine, you're going to miss games if you also go to the hospital. Right. And we've also just like historically, people have bad reactions to the second shot, like to a varying degree, but not to the point where it actually takes you out for like any substantial amount of time that having COVID would. So I was just like, man, like someone's got to sit this guy down and give him a bit like a better, more information. But I don't know if you saw this, but I saw this last night that Wiggins did get the shot.
Oh, he did.
Yeah, Steve Kerr confirmed that he got the shot. I think it was when he started to look at probably the fact that he was due to lose like $350,000 a game.
That's a lot of money, man, per game.
It's a lot of money.
That's a lot.
And for a player like Wiggins, I have to say, yes. Like that's what I think was surprising, that Wiggins became like, I think that's what you were alluding to when you said stars of like varying degree. Like it sort of surprised me that it was Wiggins who took this stance, because he's not a player who's had a substantive amount of attention on him for any part really of his NBA career. He's had a lot of like criticism, I think, level at him, but I was really curious as to why he took this stance and seemed to dig in so hard. I'm not sure if it was because, guys like Kyrie and this really small pocket had been in touch with him and were almost like saying, stand your ground. It kind of became something to stick out rather than, I don't necessarily think he actually believed so hard. What we kept hearing again and again is like, you want to stick with his convictions and his beliefs. Well, the NBA like struck down whatever his religious exemption was that he put to them, so I was kind of wondering what those beliefs actually were. But what I thought was very telling was when Steph came out on media day, and Steph strikes me as the kind of guy who's just like, as a teammate, and like, especially in the summer, he'll just be like, well, see you next year. Like, he's very much your, like, he's your office friend. Yeah. Like, he's your office friend. Like, he's there to work. But when it came to this, like this could actually impede our season. Like, I show up to work, I expect the same of my teammates. He made a couple of comments that basically like, he didn't call Wiggins dumb and what he was doing stupid, because Steph doesn't talk like that. But basically he was just like, I would expect for him to basically get the information that he needs and then basically show up to play. And anything that kind of gets in the way of that, like, I'm not really for it, And I think that was pretty telling, as politely as someone like Steph Curry would be. But I think that was pretty telling in terms of where he stood. What was a little bit more disheartening to me was when Draymond came out and like went on a very strange, like very long and drawn. If we talk about like Embiid's long kind of drawn out, right. Sometimes Draymond goes the other way. And I'm a big Draymond fan. I like his outspokenness for the most part and the things that he says, but that I found really confusing. He had like a comparison to like pregnancy. Yeah, it's like, well, your pregnant wife is probably not like a danger to public health. That's a different situation. And then when Draymond too said he didn't understand why this was being pushed so hard. and like he didn't understand, which are two totally different things, but it's being pushed so hard because like what I thought from that is, what world have you been living in, you know, for the past year and a half, almost 2 years now, as we said, like, look around you. I don't know why there would be any confusion as to why this was being pushed so hard.
Yeah, and see, and you know what I honestly thought when I first saw those comments was, oh, this is like another like very wealthy person that doesn't understand what's happening in the world at large. Like, honestly, that was my first, because in a way, if you have the level of money that Draymond Green has, like, yes, your life is affected by what's happening. And he probably knows people that have been impacted by COVID, because we all do at this point, because it's so widespread. But at the same time, like, how much different is his life really, right? And does he really see the true effects of what people are going through? Like Draymond Green was never in danger of like losing his job or like really going through like some of the hardships that like regular people, I hate going that way, but like, it's just the very first thing that came to my mind. And then I'm glad you brought that up, because that leads me perfectly to LeBron James, which is him then seeing what Draymond said and then co-signing it. I think he quote tweeted it and said, I couldn't have said it any better, like something to that effect. And it's always notable when LeBron like kind of co-signs something like that, because he doesn't do it all that often. Like, he picks and chooses his spots, even at Lakers media days. Someone asked him pointedly about why he didn't like try to participate in like PSA or anything like that. And he said, hey, if you know me, you know that I don't really like to tell people what to do and that sort of thing. And so I was just like, I guess incredibly disappointed was the way to describe what I felt about what LeBron said, because honestly, it was a kind of self-inflicted thing that he didn't really need to weigh in on. Like, he didn't need to say that. Like, there was just no reason for him to co-sign that.
And LeBron's so savvy when it comes to his image and like his brand, that I really hesitate in believing that when he makes these kinds of missteps, like, I think he understands pretty well what he's signaling. And I think that was a huge kind of, I'd say, criticism of the league, was that they didn't put any player-led PSAs out, knowing the kind of like captive audience that they have and how impactful they come out and said anything about the vaccines, you know, but like the league kind of took the stance of being like, well, we're going to let the players decide, like, we're going to let them figure this out on their own. And now that's kind of led us to this really awkward, strange holdout part that we're in. But yeah, I don't know. I think LeBron, again, he's so smart. He's so like self-aware of himself and his brand and the things that he says, that when he says things like that, it kind of sets things back. And I couldn't help but think, like, if you knew the league wanted you in a PSA, you also took quite a while. And he talked about, you know, yeah, he was hesitant to get the vaccine, but he spoke with experts. I hate the phrase, like, did his own research now, because
I really do.
it doesn't mean anything.
Said that in my, like, I was just talking to someone and I was like, oh, I had to do some research. And I was like, oh, no, wait, no, not like that. Like,
it's been co-opted.
Yeah, they stole that. Yeah, definitely.
It's been co-opted, which sucks. But he spoke people, experts in their field, and eventually decided to get the vaccine, which is great. But I think that could have been a real moment where he used that platform to say, like, yeah, I had my own doubts, but like, I went ahead and did this. So when he then quote tweeted Draymond's whole kind of train wreck of a media day, it was like, what do you do? Like, you just went back on all of that stuff that you kind of just recently came to the conclusion of. So when I wrote that, I found it irresponsible, but I also found it very strange, because it seemed like he was still straining to kind of put his name and the weight of his name behind this really outlier group of people. Yeah. You know, like, instead of just trying to like move on. If he says he doesn't want to tell people what to do, like, you kind of just did, dude.
Yeah, like, you really just stepped back into it and honestly kept the story alive. I'll be curious, and I don't know offhand, like, when the next time he's scheduled to speak or when they're going to have any availability, because he didn't play in the Lakers' first preseason game. And so we'll see, like, what happens the next time that he talks, and if it comes back up, because continuing that story that as a team, the Lakers actually did a really nice job of kind of navigating that. They had no controversy through it when they were actually doing their media day, to then have it come back up because LeBron decided to co-sign with Draymond foolishly. It's just dumb, but at the same time, like, he's probably going to have to answer for that, because people really don't forget things that LeBron James says. So we'll kind of keep an eye on that and see where that goes. But every week we end the show with a segment called Put 'em on Blast, which is my favorite segment of the week, where we basically put someone on blast for something that they did or said.
Put them on blast.
This week, I am going to let my guest Katie go first. So Katie, who are you going to put on blast?
I hope it's not a cop-out because it's an entity, but I'd like to put the NBA on blast, mostly for what we're talking in terms of this outlier pocket of vaccine, whether you want to call them anti-vaxxers or you want to call them hesitant. When I look at the lengths the league has gone to, and otherwise, whether it's social justice, the Black Lives Matter protests last summer, and like really trying to support their players throughout, you could argue that there was a line between that and the bubble, and them wanting the bubble to continue, but they still did put a substantial amount, I think, of like airtime money behind that. The little to no work that they've done internally as a league in terms of education around vaccination, when you look at leagues like the WNBA, which is now 99% vaccinated and led, even before vaccines were available to be distributed in the United States, still led player-led initiative, player to player, through the WNBPA. Not even so much of the league, because they understood it was going to be way more impactful for players to hear from whether their teammates or leaders that they trusted in the league if they had any questions, brought in experts from the CDC, brought in doctors, took the approach of like, there's really no stupid questions here. This is a brand new thing that we're all looking at and dealing with. Don't feel shy. Don't feel, like you can't ask anything. We're going to answer all of it. And like, look at where they are now. Granted, you can also look at the fact that no WNBA player can afford to leave any money on the table.
Right. When
you look at the fact that they play a WNBA season, and then most of them will play overseas for their summers. But I did want to go back to what you said when you look at what Draymond said, and we're talking about what Bradley Beal said, I do feel like a lot of this was these guys were so cared for at the beginning of the pandemic. They were put in a bubble. The bubble was, there was so much money into making sure that like nothing punctured the bubble, so to speak, that it ran really smoothly, that like COVID was like not even, I guess, out of sight, out of mind, such a small pocket of people like in the world at that point who had that privilege afforded to them. And I think to some degree, it has obviously really impacted some players. Again, it's just like a real small fraction of players in the NBA, but they're so oblivious now, like kind of willfully ignorant. And I think the NBA has a lot of responsibility there, because I think I am a big champion of player autonomy. So I don't want to say like this was up to the league to force anyone's hand, but I do think the league kind of taking a back seat and maybe hoping that guys would, have a summer, see what was going on around them, get vaccinated with their families. Obviously that didn't work for everybody, because, these are athletes who, for a lot of them, like they're on their phones a lot, they're isolated during the season, especially last season. When they were traveling, they didn't realize there's a lot of time for misinformation to spread. Right. And with the misinformation, if it gets into one guy, like, Kyrie was talking about, like the Instagram, I don't know if you read that article on Rolling Stone, but like the Instagram accounts that Kyrie was following that were talking about microchips and like satanic like rituals. Like I just like how could something like that propagate, right? And I think the league didn't necessarily do its own due diligence. And for a league that I think really champions itself on education efforts like all year round, not just for like, they've got the rookie transition program, but then they have all these other kind of like extracurricular things that they offer their players in terms of like career development and like their post playing careers, to just sort of not want to get there, like not want to wade into what had become politicized already, because that's the thing, like the league knew this was a political issue. It had been made that way, especially in the United States, and had been that way for quite a while. So I don't think there should have been any surprises for the results that they're getting now. So I do want to put the league on blast a little.
Yeah, and I think it's deserved, and I think especially when you put that, if you put that in comparison to what the WNBA has done, and kind of them being the blueprint, but also being ignored in this case. I mean, it was right there for them to copy and emulate. It was right there for a lot of different entities to copy and emulate. And honestly, I like what you said, because if we've learned one thing from this entire pandemic, it's that we can't be out here letting people stay to their own devices. Like, that's not how this is going to work. Like, nothing is going to improve or get better if we just like go hands off and say, oh yeah, just go ahead and figure it out on it. Do your own research and we'll be able to go ahead and let you do it. No, that's not, we've just learned that, right? Like, it's been a kind of unfortunate reality of the situation. But at every turn, I feel like that ends up being the lesson that we learn, is that it really is about like actual proactive education and trying to get the information into people's hands. And so I'm going to go to a totally different sport. I'm going to leave the NBA and go to college football for who I'm going to put on blast. And we're going to put Lane Kiffin, the head coach of Ole Miss, on blast. And I think this might be the first time I've ever put Lane on blast. I'm generally a fan of Lane. I've described Lane this way a lot, that I think he's very entertaining, and I like to watch and observe him be a coach. If I was Lane Kiffin's boss, I would hate it. He would not be my head coach because he's just a loose cannon, and you can't have that if you were actually going to be his boss. And so when he kind of poked the bear, they played Alabama this weekend, and Lane was kind of doing a little bit of tough talk, and like he went and did kind of an instant classic pregame interview on the SEC network, and where he was asked, if his team was ready to play, and he just was like, let's go, and just took the headset off and threw it down. The let's go didn't result in anything. Like, they ended up losing 42-21 to Alabama, who once again looks like Alabama. Like, it's like, whatever happens in the world, like, you just like, Alabama is going to be good. That 42-21 score was not as close as the game actually was. Like, it was further apart than that score would indicate, because Ole Miss scored 14 points in the fourth quarter to make that a little bit closer. So Lane Kiffin, I know you really wanted to be the first assistant to take Nick Saban down, because he's never lost to a former assistant coach of his. I think it's like 108-0 or some crazy stat like that. It's probably not that many, but it's a lot. And so for all of that, Lane Kiffin, because he couldn't get it done, he did all that tough talk, you have to go on blast. But I still like you. You're a lot of fun. I just wouldn't want you to be my coach, but you got to go on blast. Yeah, it's tough. It's hard out here for Lane. Like, I understand. Like, somebody has to be the first one, but it wasn't going to be him. And you can only poke the Alabama Bears so much because you should not be giving them motivation. But that is a good place to leave this pod. Subscribe to the podcast everywhere that you listen to them. Rate us and leave us a 5-star review. If you only leave 4, I'm inclined to think you're a hater, and nobody wants that. Make sure that you're checking out the other podcasts on the Hill Varsity Network, the Mind Your Own podcast, the Varsity Club podcast, Nebraska Prep's post-game show, and the Hill Varsity radio show. You can also check out the Hill Varsity YouTube page, where I'll be back on there with the recruiting question of the week video. You can also find us on Twitter. Get me at Greg Smith HB and at Katie at potentially the greatest Twitter handle ever at whatevs, WTEVS. It's definitely a good follow on there. I will catch you next week.
A Huda Media Production.